Hi there, I'm Betsy Detiri. I'm a consultant psychotherapist. I've authored about 8 books on trauma recovery and lots of chapters. I'm a consultant for lots of different places who have to think about children and young people and those who are supporting them and how trauma impacts them. I fully believe that you can recover from trauma, and I love to work with all sorts of adults and children and young people to try and help them understand what trauma is and therefore how you can recover from it. So the first thing I'm going to do is just explain a very little bit about what trauma is. You might think right now that's the very last thing you want to think about. You want to think about anything other than trauma. You want to think about nice things. And I get that. But the deal about trauma is the more you can understand it, the more you can actually avoid it impacting you long term. Because there's lots of coping mechanisms that we use as humans that are positive, and there's coping mechanisms that are not good for us. And if we use the coping mechanisms that are not good for us, then it can mean that long term we end up having a few more challenges or a few more difficult experiences that could be avoided if actually we know how to walk through a traumatic, terrifying experience in a way that's healthy for us. Just like with bodies, doctors and nurses, they understand us and they understand how we can best look after ourselves if we're ill. It's exactly the same in trauma. If we can explain to you a little bit of how you can best look after yourself when you've experienced some terror, powerlessness, and overwhelm, if you've been traumatized, how can you best look after yourself so there isn't a long-term impact? And so I hope this little video helps you as you try and think about how trauma might have impacted you. And so let's start by what the definition is. The definition is really important because otherwise we don't know what we're talking about. So number one, it's an experience of terror, something that just terrified you. If you're terrified, it isn't like a little bit of, oh, I don't really like that. It's that gripping feeling where sometimes you catch your breath. It's so frightening. You feel it in your body and your emotions. Terror. If you experience terror at the same time as powerlessness, so you feel that gripping fear, but you can't do anything, you don't know what to do, you can't fight, you can't fly, you're frozen on the spot, then actually that's trauma. If you add to the word overwhelm, what often happens is with all humans of all ages, we really struggle to put that into words. So very often kind people come along and say, well, do you want to talk about it? But actually the very element of trauma is you don't usually have many words to talk about it. Usually it's difficult to talk about. Usually it's really, you just don't have any words. If you're having a really bad day and your mate says, so how was your day? You tend to do more like, sounds than you do try and describe it in detail, because actually there's a part of the brain called the Broca's area of the brain, which is in this front brain, and it's responsible for speech and language. It actually has less neural activity when we feel terrified, powerless, and overwhelmed. It just doesn't have enough energy. There's not a lot going on there because we're overwhelmed. We can't think what to say. And sometimes it's even worse because people might put pressure on us and go, you can say what you like, I'm ready for you. And you end up wanting to talk about the very opposite of what you really want to talk about. You end up talking about something trivial like what you watched on TikTok or something, because actually you try to avoid talking about the thing that made you terrified because the words make it even more terrifying. And very often grown-ups don't actually understand about trauma. Loads of adults don't. Loads of people that should don't. And I'm on a mission to try and educate people so that they understand it a little bit more. So let's look at just a couple of slides that help us understand a bit of trauma. I've already said this really, but it's an experience which is either a one-off or it's repeated of terror, powerlessness, and overwhelm. If you feel terrified but you can do something about it, then actually you don't feel so bad. And the impact of that experience of terror isn't long term, it's very short term. But if you're terrified and you're powerless, you can't fight and flight, you can't do anything, you're stuck in a situation of terror, it can have long-term implications unless you begin to understand it a little bit more. I like this quote from Levine. She says, trauma happens when any experience stuns us like a bolt out of the blue. It overwhelms us, leaving us altered and disconnected from our bodies. Any coping mechanisms we may have had are undermined, and we can feel utterly helpless and hopeless. It's as if our legs are knocked out from under us. Some of you right now might be feeling like events have happened. You've seen some stuff, you've heard some things, you've been through some terrifying and overwhelming experiences, and right now it's like your legs have been knocked over and you can't move fast, and you can't sleep deeply, and you can't think of what to say, and your brain might feel a bit foggy, you might feel a bit tearful, you might be really angry, you might be on edge, you might feel all sorts of things in your body, and you might have all sorts of thoughts in your head, and you might have all sorts of pictures that are intruding in your mind. You might even hear sounds that you don't even want to hear because they're memories of past experiences where you felt really frightened. That's entirely a normal human response to an experience of terror, powerlessness, and overwhelm, to trauma. But often people don't know that, so they begin to think there's something wrong with them, and that makes them even more anxious about what they're feeling. So that's why I like to explain it a little bit more. It feels very big in your body. Trauma can shatter our sense of feeling safe and feeling stable. And for some of you, that might help you put that into words. You just don't feel so safe. And you might be talking about physical safety, but you might be talking about emotional safety. You just don't feel so okay. You're just not okay, but you don't know why. It's often connected to that word safe, and that's a complicated word. When you're a little kid, safety just means, have you got food, have you got drink, and have you got an adult that's going to make sure that you've got food and drink and that takes you to school and stuff. But the older you get, safety is a little bit more complicated because it's connected to your emotions. You see, the thing about trauma is when we understand that when we experience trauma, we will always have different reactions. Every human does. You can't say, well, I don't. You just do. It's not an option to opt out of it, just like anything else. If you do certain things, you will definitely get sick. Like if you drink off milk, you will probably throw up. Even if you've got a strong stomach, if you drink enough of it, you will throw up. That's just being a human. And it's the same with trauma. If you go through experiences of terror, powerlessness, and overwhelm, it will impact us. I still believe recovery is entirely possible, but we need to know how. And so what happens with trauma is we either feel this terror and powerlessness and overwhelm, so we want to take power, and so we want to fight back, and we want to be dominating, and we want to be in control, and we want to be angry, and we look like we're fine, but on the inside we're going, this isn't feeling okay. But on the outside we look fine because we're powerful, because we're taking control, and that's our fight reaction. Or we might have a flight reaction. We might either run away and try and avoid it, or we might run away in our mind and go, la, 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 it's not happened. It didn't happen to me. I didn't see it. I don't know anything about it. I'm just going to crack on with my life over here. And that avoidance is a very normal trauma reaction, but actually it's not helpful in the long run, and nor is the fight one. But it keeps us alive in the short term. And then there's the freeze reaction. Freeze doesn't usually mean like a scared rabbit in headlights just going, ah! It's usually internal. And freeze might mean that it hits your body where you just find it harder to get up in the morning. You find it harder to move. You might just feel very just glazed over and daydreamy. You might find it harder to think with this part of your brain because this part of your brain's gone offline, because that's your thinking brain. And instead, your amygdala, which are in the middle where my sunglasses are, that part of your brain that's responsible for fear is really got a lot of heightened energy. So it's going, inside your head, and it's looking for signs of danger, whether that's a facial reaction that's looking at you in an angry way, or it's a facial reaction of somebody staring at you. You're more sensitive to that. You're more aware of it. And so you're more on edge, waiting for danger. That's a trauma symptom called hypervigilance. You see, our freeze response can be external, but we're looking hypervigilantly, or it can be a freeze response that's actually internal and external. Well, we've just shut down. We're just not there because we're not managing to cope with these big feelings of overwhelming terror and powerlessness, and feelings of anger or sadness or injustice or frustration or grief. Sometimes some humans find them just too hard to deal with. So instead, they go to all sorts of different mechanisms to cope. And so people like me need to come along and go, no, 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 there's a better way. If we can create settings that you could feel some of those feelings a bit at a time, that gets them out. Because when they stay in, they can get a little bit poisonous and can end up doing damage. So let's just do a very, very quick overview of what some trauma symptoms can look like. And again, the reason I'm doing this is because when you feel powerless, because you've been around terrifying things, one of the most helpful things you can actually have is to get power back by learning stuff. Learning, why did I react like that? What's normal? What's not normal? What's a healthy reaction? And what shows that I'm not doing okay? When we know more about ourselves, we can actually be more empowered to go into recovery and to take action ourselves. When we don't understand, we're totally dependent on the adults around us helping us understand. And that can make us feel more powerless. And that can make us feel more annoyed or more angry or more depressed or sad. So very, very quickly, window of tolerance, it's a little theory by Dan Siegel, a guy that's a doctor in this stuff, and he says that there's two different kind of ways we can react to feelings of terror, powerlessness, and overwhelm. Hyperarousal is all of those actions at the top of the window of tolerance when we're really full of energy, we're full of strength, and we're actually ready to get into a fight. Usually that's because we're frightened of being powerless. Or we're agitated and jumpy and we can't sit still because actually we've just got so much energy running around us, which is usually energy that's actually survival energy. Or we might just be very emotionally reactive. You'll notice that, if you stub your toe when you're on holiday, you're like, yeah, whatever. But if you stub your toe when you've had a really bad day, you might be so inappropriately angry with the door that wasn't really doing anything wrong. Because that's the nature of being a human. When we're feeling really full on our insides of big feelings, the tiniest thing, somebody looking at us wrong, somebody saying the wrong thing, can just make us react in a big way. When we know that, we can begin to take more power back ourselves, because we can kind of internally go, oh, I'm showing I'm not okay. But then there's all these other trauma symptoms, which are hypoarousal, and they're more subtle. People don't always see them, and they certainly don't know that they're connected to a traumatic experience. And they're things like not feeling anything. If you don't feel anything, if you feel quite numb, if you feel quite shut down, if you're like, yeah, I'm all right, yeah, whatever. Those are actually ways of coping with trauma that aren't very good. They're not good for you. If you're actually dissociative, which is complicated, but basically you don't feel like you're quite here on the planet because you're kind of in your own mind, you're in your own planet, you're doing your own thing in your head, because being here means that what happened happened, and that's too big for you. You could just find it really hard to get out of bed. You might just find everything too much, and that's where I come to my little bucket theory, which basically says on the inside of us, we've got like a shiny bucket full of happy things that have happened to us. With me, that's all about good coffee. And then we've got a muddy bucket that's all about all the hard things, the tough things, the scary things, the worrying things, the horrible things. And they go in our muddy bucket. And the thing is, when our muddy bucket begins to get too full, that's when it begins to impact our day-to-day life. And that's when other people might notice that maybe we're not as okay as we're saying we are. And we might say, yeah, I'm fine. But our behavior is beginning to say, maybe we're not okay. Maybe we're struggling a bit. Maybe there's too much in our muddy bucket. And that's very often where we actually need a little bit of help from adults that aren't just going to listen. They're not just going to ask you what can they do to help, but they've got a little bit more knowledge of how to safely unpack your muddy buckets in a way that won't make you feel unstable or less secure or less comfortable, but actually, even though it's not easy, as you unpack the muddy buckets with an adult that can help you, actually you have more of a sense of being empowered to feel those big feelings and not pretend they're not there, a little bit at a time, so that you begin to feel like you're coming back to life again, where you've been just shut down and overwhelmed and it's too much. So it's just a couple of things that could help you just right now in the aftermath of a big horrible experience or horrible news or something that you've seen or heard that just was too much for you. It sounds ridiculously simple, and it's not the answer, but it's on the route to trauma recovery, is what we call stability. and stabilizing yourself so you don't feel so frightened of your own reactions. You're not so shocked when you do something that felt like it wasn't in your character. If you're more jumpy, or if you're more angry, or if you're more grumpy, or you can't find words, and that can make you feel frightened, because that's when you start to think, is there something wrong with me? Which I would say, no, that's a normal reaction to feeling terrified. But things like sensory support is really helpful. So on my desk here, because I work with lots of people that are having a really tough time, I've got coffee. I don't even drink the coffee. I do drink coffee, but this is just the smell of coffee. It's from Burundi, where I come from. And it just makes me feel like really quickly a lot better. And the reason I smell coffee is because A, it's not bad for you. It's not going to make me go high or low. It just makes me feel better. Because actually the part of smell, the smell in your brain, this is neurobiology, right? It's right next to your amygdala, which is your fear center. So a smell that you associate with a happy thing, it could be, I've got hand cream on my desk too. It could be hand cream, coffee, it could be some sweets, it could be Coke, just a nice smell, as in Coca-Cola. It could be a nice smell that actually just immediately makes you feel a bit calmer. You might need to experiment what that is. Lots of people find lavender helpful. Of all different genders will find lavender helpful because it's got some special way of just bringing a bit of calm to us in a healthy way that's not addictive and is not going to cause you long-term problems. Is it a blanket that it's a bit hot at the moment, but is there a blanket that just makes you, as you stroke it, it might make you feel a bit better? Is there music, some music that actually makes you feel just okay rather than too high or too low? Just go on a little bit of an exploration of those kind of things. The key thing is when we internalize, it can go wrong. It's really important to try as hard as you can to externalize, take out. So if you think of it like a bucket, if your bucket's full of awful memories and awful feelings and awful even sounds of people telling you stories or hearing people upset and crying, if your bucket is full of lots of that stuff and you can't sort it out, and it's all a big mess on the inside, one of the most helpful things you can do is to externalize, take it out bit at a time. It could be that you need to do that with art or writing or journal writing. It could be you need to make a song. It could be that you need to find a mate and agree boundaries. So it's really important that you don't just chat to any mate, because you might tell them things that they didn't know, that then make them more worried and more scared and more traumatized. So it's always important to do things like put boundaries around, which are a little bit like those things, what they call those safety rails when you're bowling. Because I am that person that has bowled with a ball at a bowling alley and got it on completely the wrong lane. That wasn't a good thing. So I still sometimes put those things up, what they call rails. And boundaries are the same thing. They're just that way of saying, do you know what? I wanna have a drink with you guys, but can we just stick to talking about how we feel, not talk about what happened, because I don't want to know more. I don't want more visual images. I don't want more thoughts. I just want to think about how we're feeling, or our best tips for how to get through this. It's really important that you take some power by using boundaries that make you feel a bit more empowered to keep yourself safe. But try and externalize in some way, because that's really, really helpful. Also, just think about what you're watching. What you're watching, what you're Googling, what you're searching for, what's on your TikTok, what's on your whatever it is that you're looking at right now. And make sure that you're not ending up watching more things that are frightening or more things that are overwhelming. Just think about that, because what you watch, what you listen to, whether that's music or your mates, it all impacts how you feel. So have a little think about that. There's a bunch of other stuff, but this is a very quick introduction, because I promise you, you can recover from trauma. You don't have to have long-term impacts for the rest of your life, and you do not have to end up mentally ill because of traumatic experiences you've had. Our brain is more flexible than that. It's like a big ball of clay, all the way up to being in your early 20s, that's so moldable that it can change. It's not stuck like a plastic brain. It can change. You can change. You can begin to take more power over your life, and you can begin whatever trauma symptoms you're having, and it's regardless whatever they are. You don't have to stay like that forever. And there's lots of other things that I can explain on what you can do, but roughly talk to somebody, but be careful, put the boundaries in. Think about your senses. How can you make yourself feel a little calmer? You might have to use your imagination to think of a safe place or a good memory, like, I don't know, being on the beach or being with a couple of your best mates in the park and having a good laugh. Think of those things, draw a picture of it, remind yourself when you're feeling overwhelmed. Choose music carefully. And then there's all sorts of other things like breathing exercises. But do you know what? I need to finish because it's just a quick introduction. Please take care. Please look after yourself, and please don't believe the lie that you're going to have these trauma symptoms for the rest of your life. And there are people out there that can help, but you're probably not going to want verbal chatting. You're probably going to need people that are just going to help guide you through recovery from trauma so that actually you can live without any memories invading your life, without any thoughts or pictures or nightmares or body memories, the way you suddenly feel that remembrance of that lack of, that sudden shock. You will get to a place where all of that is no longer in your present. So I hope you're okay. I hope this is helpful. If you need to ask questions, you're more than welcome. There's a team of us that can answer them. And take care. Hope that helps. Bye.